One of the big challenges of the new SAT math test, and in fact, the entire SAT, is that there's just so much reading. I mean, the reading section, there's a ton of passages and a lot of stuff you got to read in that 65 minutes. There's a ton of stuff to read in the writing, and then you don't really get much of a break, because even in the math, we've got questions like this number 15, which we'll go through this later in the test videos when we go through the solutions. This comes from one of the practice tests. There are questions like this, which is almost like reading a novel, right, to answer the question. So really the challenge for many students is navigating these words. A lot of times students get hung up on details in the question that really don't matter. They lose track of the kinds of things they're supposed to do. So what I want to do in this video is give you some tips on how to handle the verbiage, how to handle the insane number of words that you can see on some questions, and some tips and best practices to do that. Really, in the end, it comes down to practice, but we can have at least some approaches that can help. So the first thing to realize is that much of the problem's text is really kind of irrelevant very often. So you don't want to get hung up on things that you don't need to understand. So a lot of times on these questions, we'll see like a whole setup about, oh, this is this, and Johnny does this, and then after Johnny does this, he does this, and this is what this is. But the ultimate solution to the problem just involves plugging numbers into an equation. So kind of understanding what Johnny is doing and understanding the terms doesn't matter insofar as it doesn't affect your solution to the problem. So don't think that whenever you see a lot of text, you have to understand everything, because that maybe isn't the case. Maybe you just have to know how to translate that into math that you can then do. However, there are some questions like this one where the whole point is to understand what's going on in the text. So again, doesn't apply to every question, but I think it's a good rule of thumb that you may not need to understand as much as you think you do. Second, focus on the underlying math problem. I mean, there's a lot of reading, but it's not a reading question, right? There's math going on here, or at least logic in some way. Like this question, I wouldn't really call it math. It's more like experimental design, weirdly enough, almost science. But most of these questions, even if they've got a lot of words, there's math going on there. Maybe you just have to set up two equations. Maybe you got to translate that into one equation. Maybe you have to find a probability. I mean, in the end, there's math there. So always focus and look for the math. We mentioned this in a previous video, but pattern recognition. You want to know, and this is what you learn through these videos and through practicing, you kind of want to learn what they like to ask. What are the kinds of questions that they consider relevant? What are the kinds of things that are in bounds for them to ask? And then you want to look for it in the words that you're reading. So you want to recognize structures, recognize problem types, recognize things you've seen before, and that can help you cut through the words and get to the answer. And ultimately, this is about experience and practice, which again is why experience and practice is so important. Break the question down piece by piece. We've talked about this, and I believe I'll mention it a third time. It's just so important. You want to, if you have a whole block of text like this, trying to read it in one go and then understand it is going to be hard. Just take it sentence by sentence, even word by word, break it down. If you're going to translate into an equation, translate it word by word, sentence by sentence into math, right? So take it piece by piece. Don't try to do it all at once. Assign labels to variables and vice versa. Sometimes you just need to plug in numbers into the variables, like what I mentioned earlier. But like if they say n is cookies or something, make sure you connect in the text, even in the equation, that n is cookies, right? Just label that so you can see what these variables represent. When all else fails, skip. This is what I mentioned earlier. Let's say you're in the 38 question section, and let's say number 16 is one of these wordy type questions. If you spend 5 minutes on this number 16, you have burned a ton of time on one question, and you still have 22 more questions to go. So you don't want to get bogged down on these questions. It's a good rule of thumb across the entire test, math, reading, and writing. Do not get bogged down. You don't want to spend disproportionate amount of time on one question when you've got a lot of stuff to go. So skip it. If you feel like it's going to take you a while, there's a lot to get through, it's confusing, intimidating, skip it. Circle it and return later when you've got time, after you've finished everything else. Because it's a disaster, for example, to spend 5 minutes on this question, perhaps still get it wrong, have to rush through later questions, which might be easy, get those wrong because you had to rush. It's a disaster. If you had just skipped that question, done the easy questions first, you would have gotten all of them right, and then you go back and worry about 16. So it totally makes sense to skip when you can and be aggressive with your skipping. Of course, practice is the key. You got to get used to the question types, expectations, but also build stamina. So this is a long test. You're sitting in a chair for a long time and you're doing a lot of reading. So you got to build that stamina. You'll also practice and improve on your reading precision. So reading very carefully, not missing words, not reading something into the passage or the question that's not there. So Practice is the key, not just for testing skills, but generally speaking, for how to handle the test and how to read better. Finally, never lose track of what they want from you. So there might be a lot of text, but if they want X, then make sure you're giving them X. If they want the length of the rectangle, make sure you're giving them the length and not the width or the area. So circle or underline what they want from you in the text if necessary, but don't lose sight of the end goal. We don't really care what the problem says as long as we can get the answer. So always the focus is on getting the answer right, on getting the setup of the problem and moving forward. We don't otherwise care at all what the question's about.